What should we make of this selfie syndrome that has made its way, often unaware, into our everyday experience? Well, if you're a preacher, and I most certainly am, don't you know, you are apt to make too much of a point about it, and I intend to do that today. So I ran this by my college-age nieces recently. They are great aficionados of this selfie thing, and I basically suggested to them that, you know, this practice of posting selfies seems a bit, well, self-centered, right? That it's sort of a steady photo stream that says, look at me now, look at me here, there, and everywhere, look at me, you know. And you could just sort of see their eyes rolling back in their head. Oh, Uncle George, you are so old, you know. Yeah. You really don't understand. It's just a thing we do with our friends, and it's really harmless and all of that, you know, and maybe that's right, I don't know. But I think we have to pay attention to what the slow and unthinking effects are on us as we engage with these new forms of communication and expression. For instance, I was thinking about this scene in Matthew's gospel today in which Jesus is baptized. He's at the center of the picture that Matthew takes of him. He's standing there in the Jordan River beside his cousin John the Baptist being baptized. It's a dramatic moment, one in which the heavens open, right, and the dove descends upon him, and the voice speaks, "You are my beloved Son, and you I am well pleased." And you know, it makes me just want to say, well, capture the moment for us, Jesus. I mean, use that new short video format on Instagram or the Vine app for Twitter. It's great. Then we'll be able to have it and keep it, right? But would Jesus take a selfie? I would say that the whole idea of a selfie runs counter to what's happening in Jesus' baptism. To begin with, notice that Jesus does not baptize himself. He submits to baptism at the hands of his wild man cousin John. Right? And Matthew tells us that John had the sense to look at Jesus and try to turn the tables on him and say that you should baptize me, not the other way, because John noticed that Jesus was holier than he. And fortunately for me, Jesus recognized that it wasn't the holiness of the one doing the baptizing that made all the difference. Because after all, I am not only George the Baptist, but also George the baptizer oftentimes too. And so this is comfort to me that Jesus submitted himself to someone who was not spiritually his superior even, to be baptized. What an act of humility. That's still an important part of baptism. It's a personal affair, but it's never a private matter. It's between you and God, but it's not only between you and God. At the beginning of the very Baptist movement that gives us life in the early 17th century, John Smith was an Anglican priest in England who had started to come to the conviction that the Church of England could not be adequately reformed. The clergy was guilty of and not pure and holy and these sorts of things. And plus the whole system of a church that was not gathered intentionally was to be questioned from the New Testament. And so he came to the conviction that the church should only consist of those who voluntarily enter into it by baptism consciously. And so he baptized himself. And then baptized his small flock, and they formed the First Baptist Church. Well, then they were fleeing persecution. They went to the lowlands in Holland and ran into the Mennonites, an Anabaptist group that are our spiritual forebears, and they began to talk with them, and John Smith became convinced that he had done the wrong thing, that really no one baptizes oneself, and so he submitted to baptism at the hands of that community, and then the Baptist movement has followed that practice ever since, that baptism really is not just between the individual and God, it's also between that individual and the people of God. But it involves a church of sinners and saints. In other words, you have to submit to other people in this spiritual process of becoming part of community when you are part of what God wants you to do in the world.